Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our new study that we're beginning today. You made it through the cold. It's never cold in Vancouver. I'd been promised that when I moved here. People lied to me. It's cold today, but it's not snowy, so that is good. But you made it through. Welcome to week one of what looks to be probably about a 21-week series. Yeah. So it's a long series because it's a big book. We're beginning with the Gospel of John. So let me kind of begin by reminding you a bit of the philosophy of ministry that we have when it comes to this class, okay? So it's a Vision Cast Sunday if you're in the first service. Today's my theme is Vision Cast Sunday. And so I talk a bit about our philosophy of ministry to a degree. But let me remind you about the philosophy of ministry for the adult Bible class here. So as I understand what we do things here, when I preach on a Sunday and stand on the platform, I envision that was sort of like Jesus speaking at the Sermon on the Mount, when he had this crowd of people in front of him and he preached to them. And in that crowd was everything from, in the front row, his disciples who were following him day by day, to the back row, meaning maybe Roman centurions, and mixed within there would be Pharisees and Sadducees, religious scholars, mixed in with farmers and everyday Jewish people and the odd Gentile as well. So Jesus had in front of him a crowd of all different types of people, a whole cross-section of the world back then. And so when he preached, he had to communicate in a way that everyone would understand. The scholars and the Gentile centurions who had no idea about the Torah or anything like that. And that's how I envision myself and all of our preachers. I encourage them to think in those terms when they're writing sermons on a Sunday. You need to communicate in a way that everyone can understand. That's our Sunday services. Our midweek classes, including this class right now, is different. I consider that more like when people came to Jesus afterwards and said, "Hey, Jesus, what did you mean when you said that? What did you mean by this? What did you mean by that?" Where he then unpacked and explained to people who wanted to dig deeper, who wanted to know more. That's what this class is all about, okay? So we go to a depth in this class that we don't go to when we're talking to a vast crowd of people, okay? This is for people who want to know more, who want to dig a little bit deeper. So in this class, that's why every year what I seek to do is go verse by verse through a book of the Bible. I also seek to teach on different doctrines in this class. And then the third thing I'd seek to do in this class is touch on controversial subjects. So verse by verse, in this class over the last 16 years, I have personally gone through the Gospel of Mark, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Peter, James, and the book of Revelation. Now, the key to studying a book in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament as well, is determine its genre. Now, what that simply means is it's a category or a family or a style. Determine the book's, the piece of literature's genre, its style, meaning you would read poetry different than you would read a police report. You would read poetry different than you would read a legal contract, right? Words are used differently, and it's a whole different genre, different style of writing, and so you would interpret it differently. Well, what we're about to study is a gospel. So the question is, what genre is a gospel? What type of literature is it? Now, initially, the term gospel didn't refer to a specific literary genre. By the way, I'll let you know when it's the first blank, so don't get nervous. It's going to be a couple minutes. You're not going to miss it. I'll let you know. So initially, the word gospel, though, didn't refer to a specific literary genre in the first century. It's a translation of the Greek word evangelion, where we get our word evangelist or evangelical. It's a Greek word, evangelion. It literally just loosely means good news, okay? And evangelion was used in the Greek language, the Romans used it, the Greeks used it. It used to refer to a proclamation of good news from the battlefield. So a headline, good news, we defeated our enemies. So it'd be good news, evangelion. It also was used in Rome as a term to describe any royal pronouncement of a new birth. There's a new prince has been born or princess, or if there's a new ascension to the throne, it was evangelion, it was good news. And so then it began to be used as the term to describe what was preached about the story of God's activity on earth through Jesus of Nazareth. That became, so the Christ followers kind of didn't hijack it, but they took it, the evangelion of Jesus. The good news, the proclamation of great news through Jesus of Nazareth. And over the years, the term gospel got transferred from a secular word to a purely Christian word. So now gospel doesn't refer to good news from the battlefield or a proclamation from the king or the Caesar about the birth of something. It exclusively tends to mean one of the four gospels, first four books in the New Testament. Now, scholars can generally be placed in two camps, two extremes, when it comes to understanding the nature of a gospel as a literary genre. And this is important. Some treat the four gospels without any literary precedent whatsoever, meaning they simply say gospels that you have in the New Testament are not some particular ancient genre from the first century. They're just written down sermons. Some will say this. This is the minority, but some will say all they are is four sermons that have been written down, four sermons about Jesus' life. So that's not a genre per se. It's a sermon. If you're looking for a genre, they say a gospel is simply a sermon that's been written down. Okay? Some would say that. Others treat the gospels as though they're imitating first century Greco-Roman biographies. Now, this was a genre, first century Greco-Roman biographies. Okay? It was a particular genre. And there were rules for first century Greco-Roman biography, the rules that you had to follow. And so these were very popular back then, and you would write a biography preserving the memory or celebrating the exploits or the virtues or the teaching of a famous person. And there was sort of some format or set of rules for a first century Greco-Roman bio. For example, and they're different than biographies today. First century Greco-Roman biographies, chronology was not important. For us, you start at the beginning, when the person was born, and then their childhood, and then the young adult, and so on till their death. That's how we understand a biography today. Not so with first century Greco-Roman biographies. What they did was they would pick a theme about this person, and then they would arrange the events around that theme. So they might put something that happened later in the life at the beginning to set the theme and then build around that. So chronology was not essential in first century Greco-Roman biographies. You need to understand that. As well, sensory details were not important, meaning you wouldn't read in first century Greco-Roman biography the sand crunched under the feet of the men and women as they walked along the seashore. That sensory stuff, now they didn't highlight that kind of stuff. It wasn't that type of poetic, flowery. It was more exploits, key themes and thoughts and so on. So here's the question. Is the Gospel of John a first century Greco-Roman biography? Is it or is it not? It's not the blank yet. Hold on. Relax. A balanced approach has kind of evolved over the centuries, where these two extremes are blended, where the gospel writers were certainly influenced by first century biographies, but they didn't strictly follow the rules in the gospel writers. And these scholars seem to think that these writers, what they did was they blended the format of first century biographies, and they blended with the feel of dynamic preaching about the teaching and the preaching of Jesus. And they kind of blended these two things together. So these dynamic preaching and teaching of Jesus was then kind of blended into the format of a first century Greco-Roman bio. So it's a hybrid of these two things really together. So they would talk about the life of Jesus, wouldn't necessarily follow in chronological order, because that wasn't a rule in the first century Greco-Roman bios. So you'll often hear me when I'm preaching, and I'll say, in John, a biography of Jesus, I will loosely use that term so people understand. What is the gospel? Think of it as a first century biography of the life of Jesus, okay? So it's likely best to see it as a hybrid of preaching of, first century preaching about Jesus put down in the form of a biography. loosely following the rules of a Greco-Roman biography. So, the four Gospels are certainly historical documents, but each author had a theme, an emphasis, and they sometimes arranged the events in Jesus' life to better communicate their theme. We do this all the time now. Think about when perhaps you go to a funeral and people go up and give a eulogy about the individual. And they will often tell stories. Oh, I remember when brother so-and-so did this. And I remember he once did this. Well, we don't necessarily assume that the second event he talked about came after the first one. Hey, is that chronologically correct? We don't care. They're telling the story. They want to tell you what a good guy this person was, and so they're picking stories from that person's life, not necessarily in chronological order, but to follow their theme. That's sort of what the Gospels are like as well, okay? Some of it's chronological, but that wasn't a rule, okay? So here's your first blank. The literary genre of a gospel is based upon a first century Greco-Roman biography. It's based upon, okay? It's not 100%, but you could safely call it was a first century biography of Jesus. In the end, maybe the simplest answer to the question, what is a gospel, would be a gospel is a book about Jesus. That's the simplest way. A gospel is a book about Jesus, okay? Now, we need to understand this as well. For the first couple of decades after Jesus' resurrection, nothing was written down per se. The Gospels were written a couple of decades afterwards, and we'll get to that in a moment. Because initially, in that culture, everything was orally transmitted. It was a high memorization. Most people were illiterate. So everything was memorized. So they would tell stories, and these stories would be memorized and passed on. And so the life of Jesus was memorized and passed on from person to person. And you need to understand as well, initially, they thought Jesus was going to return really soon, within their lifetime. So there's no point in writing stuff down. It was only later when apostles started to die, they began to realize, we need to codify, we need to write down these traditions that these eyewitnesses have seen. This needs to be recorded, okay? And that's when the Gospels began to be written down, per se. Okay, which brings us to the question in your outline. B, who wrote the Gospel of John? Even saying Gospel of John is kind of lazy. It's the Gospel according to John. The Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Luke, and we'll get to why that differentiation is important in a second. But who wrote it? Who wrote the Gospel of John? It kind of sounds like a silly question initially. It's like saying, so what's Billy's name? Who wrote the Gospel of John? Well, you just answered your own question. It's the Gospel of John, right? Well, who wrote the Gospel of John is a legitimate question when you understand the history of ancient documents. Strictly speaking, all four Gospels are internally anonymous. What do we mean by that, internally anonymous? Meaning, within the document itself, their names aren't mentioned. It doesn't say anywhere from John 1 to John 21:25. Nowhere in there does it say, and my name is John. Okay? Same with Matthew, same with Mark, same with Luke. Nowhere in the document are their names mentioned. They are internally anonymous. But we know what Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke, and John. Well, how do we know that? Well, this is what we'll get to explain in the next couple of moments. But first, the question might be, well, why the anonymity? Why does it not say right within the document who wrote it? Well, first of all, you need to keep in mind that first century books or first century documents didn't have cover pages like our books do today. They were scrolls, and scrolls were very, expensive. So you just squeezed as much information on that scroll as you could. So there was no, they didn't have the luxury of having this big blank cover page, the Gospel according to John, blank one, and then turn it. They didn't have that luxury. And first century documents, particularly many first century biography writers did not include their names in the document. The famous manuscript of Plutarch, for example, doesn't have his name anywhere in it, but it was known historically Plutarch wrote it, or his son. So this is not unique to the New Testament Gospels. First century biographies often were internally anonymous, but everyone knew who wrote them. As well, these books, these Gospels, were not considered the property of any one individual, but of the entire Christian community. So John, it's not as though he wrote this, published it, and then got publishing money for it or anything like that. Hey, that's my copyright. That's my intellectual property. No, it wasn't that way at all. It was written down and sent out to the churches. It was the property of the Church of Jesus Christ. It wasn't owned by John per se. Well, then you say, well, if the names weren't formally attached to the Gospels, how do we know who wrote the 4 Gospels? Well, the early church knew who the authors were. That's what gave these Gospels their authority. Okay? So that's crucial to understand that. The early church knew who wrote each Gospel, because it was only because we know who John is, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we know them, we know their background. That's what gave each Gospel its authority. And keep in mind, there's a season when you would be killed if you held scriptures in your hands. And so you wanted to know that the scriptures you had and could possibly die for was authentic. You don't want to die for a counterfeit. So it was very important to them, those early Christ followers, that they knew that the scriptures that they had been entrusted, had been given to them, that had been passed on to their local congregation, were authentic, true, eyewitness accounts. And so this was very important from the very beginning, that the early church, they knew who wrote each one. In order to be considered New Testament scripture, the writers had to come from what's called the apostolic circle. Apostolic circle. Meaning, it was written by an apostle, or it was written by someone who was closely connected to the apostles. Okay? So for it to be anywhere to be considered scripture, it had to come from the apostolic circle. That's true of all the letters in the New Testament as well. So, for example, if you look at the 4 Gospels, Matthew was written by Matthew. Now, when we say written by, let's understand this. Probably every one of these was a group project, meaning there were editors, there other people contributed to it. Research was done. Luke says, I researched all this, so he interviewed people and so on. So Matthew's name was attached to it because he would have overseen it all, and he attached his authority as an apostle, one of the 12 apostles. He attached his name as the authority, so they knew it was an authoritative document. But it would be naive to think that Matthew wrote every word in Matthew's gospel. He approved of it, but other people would have contributed. Okay? So Matthew was one of the disciples. Mark was written by Jean-Marc, and he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but he was a companion of Peter. So when you're reading Mark, you're essentially reading Peter's version of events, okay? And we went verse by verse through Mark here in this class. You can watch it online. Luke was a companion of Paul. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he also wrote Acts. Many people consider Luke and Acts to be one big book, okay? But so Paul the apostle, he was the companion with Luke. He traveled with Paul, and so he was in the apostolic circle. And then John. So the question is, who was John? That's what we're about to answer in a moment here. Okay, so it's also important to understand, historically, no other names have been attributed to these 4 Gospels. It's not as though, there's a debate. There's Gospels of Matthew out there that are called Gospel of Barnabas or Gospel of Lucian. No, every historical version we have of Matthew has Matthew's name on it. Same with Mark, Luke, and John. So it's not as though there's these these Gospels are out there under different names or pseudonyms. No. Historically, every time we see Matthew's Gospel, it's got his name attributed to it. From the very beginning, it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the very start. So there are no other ones out there under those names. The writers of the 4 Gospels, what they did was they were each known by their original audience. So let's just stick with Matthew at the top. Matthew would have written his gospel for a particular audience, sent it to them. They knew it came from Matthew. They knew Matthew. They knew it came from him. They would have copied it, and then they would have assigned his name to it as they passed it on to the next house church. They copied it. This is Matthew's gospel. Okay, the gospel according to Matthew, because there's only one gospel. There's the gospel of Jesus according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John. It's like a diamond. It's only one diamond, and there's 4 different perspectives of looking at that diamond. That's what the Gospels are. There's only one gospel, one message of Jesus, one life, and there's the one according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. 4 different perspectives of this same life. 4 different themes, 4 different emphases, okay? And so that original audience would have received the gospel according to Matthew, would have copied it, and then sent it off to another local congregation. They would have done the same. Oh, this is Matthew's gospel. Yes, okay. And they would have done the same and attributed his name to it. So internally, it doesn't have his name, but externally, his name was attached to it from the very beginning. So in order to verify its authorship, therefore its authority, the copy would include the name of the author as a way of distinguishing it and validating it. So this is how they initially were spread, with the names of the authors attached. And we have strong and very early historical tradition identifying the authorship of all 4 of the New Testament gospel writers. As I said, historically, there have been no other names attached to these gospels, none, than the ones that are presently attached. So when it comes to this gospel, here's your next blanks. The following facts are apparent. So while the gospel itself doesn't include the name of its author, but there are hints inside, which we'll get to, there is some disagreement, not a lot, there's some over this issue. Scholars do agree on the following facts. A, the author was a Jew. There's no doubt. Scholars agree the author was a Jew. B, the author was rooted in ancient Judea and Samaria. So the author knew all about Judea, Samaria, modern-day Israel. They knew the land, their traditions. They were very familiar. So it's not as though it's someone from, some here trying to describe what's happening in another country. No, this was someone who was very familiar with that terrain. C, the author was an eyewitness to what they described. They're an eyewitness to what they described. Listen to the very last couple sentences of the Gospel of John. John 21, 23, 24, the author writes this. He said, because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple, Jesus said something about the disciple John, we believe was John. And then the author writes, because of this, rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus didn't say that he wouldn't die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. So he's saying that disciple who was there on the beach on the shore of Galilee that Jesus referred to is the disciple who saw all this and who's just written everything down that you've just read. Okay? So we know he was an eyewitness. And D, the author was an apostle. Whether the author was one of the 12 apostles, there were many other apostles, but there was 12 particularly chosen. Apostle meaning a sent one, an eyewitness who's been sent. So there were many who did that. Hundreds of people followed Jesus. Remember when Judas had to be replaced? They replaced him with another apostle. Paul was an apostle as well. So the question becomes, it comes down to really 2 big names. Both are named John. So as your outline says, for those reasons, along with historical testimony of the church fathers, many believe, I personally believe, that the author was the Apostle John, one of the 12 apostles. I believe that John, who also wrote the book of Revelation, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John as well, I think it's from the same author here. Okay? But not everybody agrees with that. Some also think it was, so there's John, that would be John, the son of Zebedee, would be the apostle. Then there was John the Elder, another gentleman called John the Elder, who was an apostle, a follower of Jesus, was very well known in Jerusalem by the other disciples and very well respected. Some people think maybe it was John the Elder who wrote this. Either John the son of Zebedee or John the Elder. There's variations on that. We don't know absolutely for sure. But there is strong, I think, evidence for being John, the son of Zebedee, the 12th one of the apostles. I'll tell you why. Because chronologically or historically, you had the apostle John, so that John, the son of Zebedee. And then he had a disciple or student whose name was Polycarp, a disciple of John. And then Polycarp had a student, Irenaeus. Okay? So Polycarp was a direct disciple of John. Irenaeus was a direct disciple of Polycarp, and we have their writings as well. And Irenaeus, he wrote in his writings that the Apostle John was the author of this gospel. So Irenaeus apparently got from Polycarp that John the Apostle wrote this. Okay? So that's pretty strong. And he also, Irenaeus, wrote that Luke wrote Luke's gospel as well. Okay. So, as I said, it's the gospel according to John, meaning it's John's perspective on the life of Jesus. Now, a couple of years ago, we went verse by verse through the gospel of Mark. And now we're doing the gospel of John. You need to know those weren't just random decisions that I made. Why did I choose Mark first and now John? Well, because Mark, now there's some debate about this. There's debate about everything, right? Some people think the Leafs are great. Some think they're terrible. Right now, I think they're terrible, but that's a whole other decision. But so Mark is generally believed by most to be the first, the earliest gospel. And then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a resource, and they wrote their gospels with Mark on the side here. Mark is sort of their home base. They're using his material because a lot of Mark's material is reproduced in these two, more than these two being reproduced in Mark. They've done scholarly studies on this. They're very textual criticism. It's very thorough. So most believe, some think Matthew, but most believe, I would say, that Mark. So that's why I did Mark first. Because these Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. Sometimes you'll hear that term, the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means taking the same point of view. That's what synoptic means. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are kind of taking the same point of view. They're sharing material with each other, okay? John is different. John is not one of the synoptic gospels. It's agreed upon, was the last of the gospels to be written. And John, though I'm sure he knew about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, did not source his gospel through them. John went in a completely different direction. It's different in style and theme and everything from the synoptic gospels, okay? So I thought by doing Mark, I've sort of covered Matthew and Luke, though there's still different material in these as well. But for the most part, by Mark, I've covered the synoptics, and now I wanted to do John, another different perspective of the life of Jesus. That's why I've done it this way, okay? Now we turn to John's gospel, because his gospel is distinct from the other three. It's not rooted, as I said, in Mark, Matthew, or Luke. Though while covering the same events for the most part, John's gospel appears to be unique and distinct in its style and its flow. Okay? More about that later. So when was this gospel written? Letter C on your outline. In comparison to the other three gospels, John was the last one to be written. As your outline says, the Gospel of John was likely written sometime between 70 AD and 85 AD. These dates are imprecise, but that's 70 AD. Remember what happened in 70 AD? That was when Jerusalem was overthrown, the temple was destroyed. Cataclysmic year in the life of the nation of Israel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's believed, were written before the temple was destroyed. John was written afterwards, okay? Now, historically speaking, you should know this is incredibly close to the events of Jesus. Other historians, Aristotle, his writings, I go through this in Skeptic, which I'm going to begin in a few weeks, but there's a 1,400-year gap between the originals and the earliest copies of Aristotle's writing. Homer's Iliad, 500-year gap. The Gospels, 45, very, very brief gap. The most, 150-year gap between the earliest copies we have and when the originals were written. So that's like a photocopy, historically speaking, okay? And we have thousands and thousands of copies, so we can compare them, and we know that what we're reading when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was what was originally written. So understand what we've just talked for the last half hour. You'll hear a lot of people, well, some people will say, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. That's not true. On the surface, it looks like it's true, but it's not true. And we don't even know if this is what was originally written. No, that's not true either. Historically, we do know that it's not debated anymore by people who make this their living. to be textual critics and to study first century documents like this, there is a consensus that what we have is what was, 90, I think, what's the number that I saw? 98.9% certainty. So in other words, in the New Testament, there's 138,000 words in the New Testament. Of those 138,000 words, we have absolute certainty of 136,600 of them. There's just a few that we're not absolutely certain of. And those ones have nothing to do with any doctrines or anything important. It's like that your joy may be full or that our joy may be full. Which is it? We're not sure. That's what makes up the other, 1,400. Okay? So we know in the Gospels and the New Testament letters that what we're reading is what was originally written. That's really not debated. Okay, where was this Gospel written? As your outline says, the author was likely writing from the ancient city of Ephesus. This again was according to Irenaeus, and Eusebius as well made this statement. Ephesus was John's hometown. Ephesus, I believe, is also where Mary, Jesus' mother, ended up living, traditionally. Okay? It was a real center of the church at one time. Why was this gospel written? Well, let's read John 20, verse 31. The writer answers that. It says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So as your outline says, the Gospel of John was written with the purpose of encouraging them to believe in Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of God. All right, how is this gospel unique? Well, first of all, as your outline says, the Gospel of John is unique in its structure. It's unique in its structure. And we'll go quickly through this last piece here. For example, it's different from the synoptics in the sense that, like, Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, and it's all about action. And immediately following. Mark's just, if you remember when you went through it with us, it's just action. Lots of miracles, lots of movement, lots of action. John is almost the opposite. John has more and longer narratives and fewer miracles. John's more about, Mark is type A personality. Just give me the facts. Let's go. What happened? Next, what happened next? John is more, let's sit down, have a cup of tea. So tell me, what happened next? And then what did he say? Then what did she say? Oh, then what did he say? Tell me more. John is more conversational, okay? Lots of conversations. That's why it's longer. And it has a distinctive flow to it. This is the flow that we're going to be following over the next several weeks. Begins with the prologue, which we'll start with next week. Then the prelude to his public ministry. And you can read that. I'll let you read that yourself. That's the flow we're going to be following. Number two, the Gospel of John is unique in some of its terminology. The next blank. Some of its terminology. For example, the concept of logos. That's the Greek word for word. We're going to come up against this next week. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now, Logos, like, what does this mean? This was a complex philosophical, theological concept. So how would John, why would he be using this complex theological concept? What did he mean by in the beginning was the Word? We're going to unpack this next week, and it's fascinating what it's all about. When the Bible says the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, only John talks about the Logos, the Word. And it had different layers of meaning in the first century, and we're going to see how John used those layers of meaning. B, in John, there's a unique terminology, there's a unique emphasis upon Jewish feasts. In the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they only mention the Sabbath and Passover, Passover. In John's gospel, he mentions 3 Passovers, Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Dedication, Sabbath, weddings, and funerals. So he's more into the culture and so on in John's gospel. He's more emphasizing the Jewish feasts, and he uses the feasts that Jesus was at to apply what Jesus said. So he would tie the feast with, if the feast invited a lot of, or used a lot of candles or whatever, Jesus would talk about, I am the light of the world, and so on. So he would tie Jesus' sayings with the feast where Jesus said it at. See, what's unique to John is the emphasis upon the Father-Son relationship in the gospel, in the Godhead, is unique to John. Interesting statistic. Using the term Father or Heavenly Father, in Mark's gospel, it's used 5 times. In Luke, it's used 21 times. In Matthew, 42 times. In John, 122 times. So John zeroes in on Jesus' use of the Father-Son relationship in the Godhead. And he talks about, where Jesus quoting, the Father and I are one. And so what does he mean by that? Is he saying he is the Father? No, the Greek shows us that he's not saying that. He's talking about a functional unity, an equality of nature. After Jesus said that, then the religious leaders picked up stones to stone him because he said he's making himself equal with God. They knew what he was saying. So we're going to learn what he was saying when we get to John chapter 10. And then D, the perceived presence of anti-Jewish tones. Some people claim that the Gospel of John is anti-Semitic. Because, John's often, and the Jews did this and the Jews did that. And John chapter 8, for example, is probably one of the key passages where there's what appears to be anti-Semitic type words or anti-Jewish polemic stuff, He's talking to the Jews. Jesus said, very truly I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. I know that you're Abraham's descendants. You're looking for a way to kill me because you have no room for my word. I'm telling you what I've seen in the Father's presence, and you're doing what you have heard from your father. And he goes on to say, your father's the devil. And people say, wow, he's really trashing the Jews here. Is John anti-Semitic? We're going to address that. So, next week, we're going to begin by interacting verse by verse with perhaps the most famous and powerful declaration about Jesus the world has ever seen. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. We're going to dive right into that, into the deep end of the pool next week. All right, I've got a couple moments for any questions about what we've discussed today. Yes, Bob. What language would Jesus have been speaking? Probably Aramaic for the most part would have been language. He would have understood Greek as well, particularly from his childhood because he worked in Nazareth next door to Sepphoris, which was a Gentile city, and he would have worked there. So he would have been fluent in Greek as well, as many of them were. Sepphoris, I should say. Yes, most of original, they would have had to translate from Aramaic to Greek. Most definitely. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
What's the organization that kind of put the Bible together and chose these books? It's my understanding that there's some books that didn't really make it in. So I'm wondering, what's the group of people that?
Yeah. They're called the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. I'm kidding. Those are Jehovah's Witnesses. The question is, what group put these together? I strongly recommend you watch the class we did called The Doctrine of Revelation, where I unpacked, explained all of that, how it happened historically. But what happened was, the debate was never what books weren't in it that should be. The debate was always what books are in it that shouldn't be. So that's very important. There was never doubt so much about books that weren't in it that should be. The debate was, so there was unanimity. It was the early church. The early church leaders, the disciples, the apostles, they were the ones who, because they were part of the apostolic circle, so they were authorized. These documents were authorized, so there was never doubt about them. The issue was some of them that have been accepted, should they be? Hebrews was debated. James was debated. Revelation was debated. Most of them, though, there was no debate whatsoever. So the debate wasn't what isn't in that should be. The debate was what is in that shouldn't be. Okay? Yes?
Well, you've used it a couple of times, maybe we should be for next week, but is the English word beginning a good word for that? Because I was under the
Beginning?
that God always was.
Oh. No, it says in the beginning. Yes. Well, let's talk about that next week. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So yes, what does that mean, in the beginning? Yes.
What's the difference between narrative genre and gospel genre?
The difference between narrative genre and gospel genre. Now, I'm not a scholar, as you know, but I think, I'd be guessing, but I think gospel genre is more the modern gospel genre or the ancient? Like, gospel genre today is more including the preaching dynamic. A narrative would be more an article that you'd write for a magazine. A gospel would be more a sermon with a theme, so it's more dynamic. That's been my surface understanding of the distinction between the two. Narrative is more closer to maybe a police report, as opposed to a gospel is more that hybrid blending. But that's just from my cursory surface level reading, so don't quote me on that. There's another hand back, yes. Yeah, which Bible version would be the best to study? Again, I strongly recommend you go on our website and look for my class on the Doctrine of Revelation. But with the different translations, what we need to understand is we have it's not as though there are different Bibles. There's only one Bible, okay? Bible is a collection. I'm about to do a series on Sundays in a couple months on how not to read the Bible. And so we'll sort of explain a bit more. But what we need to understand is that there's only one Bible. The original language, that's agreed upon. That's understood. Now you have translations of those. We have different translations. Why do we have different translations? They're not different Bibles. They're different translations of the original document that everyone agrees upon. And why do we have that? Well, there's at one end of the continuum is word-for-word translations, and at the other end is more fluid, or what's the word? Thought for thought. It's more dynamic. So, for example, let's say the original language is French. Bonjour. Okay. One translation, if it's word for word, is good day, because that's literally what bonjour means. Good day. Another translation could be hi. Hello. That's not literal, but it communicates what was being said. Okay? And so that's essentially what translations are about. They're about, so you'd think literal would be the easiest and best. Not always. Because sometimes what was literally said back then in that culture is not what would be communicated today. The words have changed, the meanings have changed, so you could put literally what was said, but that isn't what we know they were trying to communicate. So that's where the translators have thought, well, what do we do? Do we put literally what was said, but not what was meant? And so that's where editors had to make these decisions of more dynamic translations. And so that's all translations are. They're an attempt to take what was originally written, what we agree on, was only one version of that, and communicating that in a modern language thousands of years later when language is so dynamic. And that it's changed, like we've talked about, you could say 60 years ago, you could say, that is a gay person. Well, that meant a happy person. But now, gay doesn't mean gay anymore. And so, think if that's true in 50 years of a language, think about thousands of years how language has evolved. And that's what translators are trying to do. Communicate the original thought in today's vernacular. That's a challenging job. And that's why you have different translations. Good question. All right, folks, God bless you. Next week, same time, same channel. Hope to see you then.